played a role in the share, which means everybody here and those watching at home. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. In particular, Avram Eliezer, when he's here, when he's there, somehow plays a role in the share being broadcast wherever it is, amongst other things too. So thank you very much, Avram Eliezer.
Go ahead.
Donuts. We'd like to, yes. We'd also like to thank Mr. Sore Throat in the back. Not saying any names, but thank you for staying out of retirement. Now, what I would like to do today, usually try to have a recap of all the shiurim, the last share of the year. I plan on doing it the last few minutes of the share. Being the fact that this is the last share, and still so many topics I wanted to get to this season, which we'll have to push off. But we have a big topic today, so I hope to get to, at the end, a quick recap of the year's shiurim. Now this year, we had the schus of doing, this will be our third historical perspective, halachic perspective, more of a posek. We fondly took on the challenge to do Moshe Feinstein, as well as going back a little earlier to Reb Chaim Ozer Grudinsky, posek in Europe. So I had a recommendation that perhaps you should consider giving a share in the Sredei Aish with Yechiel, Yaakov, Weinberg, who really was the same period as Reb Chaim Ozer. And upon further review, I do think it's an important person to give a share on in halacha, especially since, as we'll talk about soon, there's a lot has been written, especially post Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg being nifter in 1966. There's a lot that's been written about him. A lot of people are very fascinated with his personality, and there's a lot of interesting definitions of him. And a lot of it, we're talking about historians, Jewish historians, from across the gamut, from the left to the right. There are many that portray him, in certain ways. And I think this is not a historical share, this is more halachic share. I think the perspective you have of Adam Gadol through the prism of halacha is a much different perspective than somebody who studies just history. I remember one of my rebbeim once commenting that he met the world's expert on Rabbeinu Peretz, one of the Rishonim. And this person came to his shul to lecture on Rabbeinu Peretz, and he was talking all about him. And my Rebbe told me, he's like, he knew a lot about Rabbeinu Peretz. He knew his history and this, but you could tell he never really spent time trying to understand work and Harv in the Beis Medrash on the words of Rabbeinu Peretz. To really understand the man, you have to learn. He spent his life writing Torah. That's where, if you really want to understand the person, you'll see, I believe it stems from their Torah. And today's perspective on the Sredei Aish is going to be from that lens. I'm just seeing his Torah. But just to first give a quick biography, on all accounts, Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who we'll refer to as the Sredei Aish, which is the name of the Sefer, was born in Eloi, a genius. He was born in 1884 in Poland. He learned famously in the yeshiva Slobodka, where he was very close to the Alter of Slobodka. He was set up to learn as chavrusas. One of his chavrusas was Naftali Amsterdam, who was one of the chief Talmidim of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He actually had a Seder learning with him Ksos. But he was very, very influenced by the Alter. A close Talmud, part of the group of amazing, all the future Rosh Hashivas all passed through Slobodka. The Alter was famous for being a tremendous mechanech. There's one quick story I'll tell. I just heard this when I was in Eretz Yisrael, actually by one of the descendants of the Finkel family, where the Alter's family, where one time a young Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg was talking to the Alter, and it was clear he was saying over a story that happened with him in Holy Amsterdam. And he was all caught up in his learning, and he told Holy Amsterdam that he forgot to daven because he was caught up in his learning. Holy Amsterdam's face turned white. So quickly he caught himself and said, "I forgot to daven with a minion." He lied. As a bacher, he was embarrassed. When he told this story over to the Alter told him, "You have to travel to Naftali." This is past, I guess, the time he was together with Naftali, and beg mechila from him for lying to him. And he thought it was the most awkward thing ever to go and travel to this Torah giant through Naftali Amsterdam and ask mechila for lying to him. But the Alter was insistent this is what he has to do, so he went and he traveled to him. He's about to knock on the door. This is Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. He's about to knock on the door, and all of a sudden he gets a tap on the shoulder. Another Talmud from the Slovak Yeshiva says, "Okay, the Alter says you can come back." The Alter sent me. No, come back. He comes back to the Alter. The Alter said, "Look, I felt that you needed to grow from that mistake that you made in lying by being ready to go and ask mechila. But I didn't want you to be embarrassed." So he made him go, but stopped him right before he went in. That was the pedagogy of the Alter of Slobodka. That's what he grew up with. He was so close to the Alter set up a shidduch for him. He married the orphaned daughter of a Rav, some little town in, I believe, near Russia. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't work out. In fact, that's one of the things the biographers like talking about. But not long after the marriage, without children, did that marriage end. And at that point, Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, though he was successful in this post, taking over that deceased father-in-law's stellar in the community, he was there for about 6 years. But after his divorce, he left the town, and he actually went to Berlin, to the university, to study, wanted to study Russian. It seems at some point the Chafetz Chaim himself, the Frode of Atzmo, came and tried to pry him away from the university. He told him he just wants to go and learn Russian. Lamaisa, after that stint in the university, he was offered a job to head the Hildesheimer school in Berlin. Those that know the famous Yechiel started by Rav Shamshon Fuller Hirsch, had a major school which definitely taught secular studies, but also had a Torah program. And in fact, under different Rosh Hashivas, they advanced the Torah program to also produce Rabbanim. And Rev Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg served at the helm of this yeshiva for quite a bit, and he had a big hashpah, a big impact on the Talmidim over there. In fact, at one point, while he was the head of this school, this yeshiva, he was offered to become the Av Bezin in London. But the Talmidim in the yeshiva prevailed upon him not to leave, so he stayed. Instead, that position of the Av Bezin of London went to some Yechiel Abramsky, a famous note, who served there as the Av Bezin. Maisa, World War I, World War II came. During World War II, he ended up in the Warsaw Ghetto and ended up with pretty preferential treatment as being a Rav, as being someone who was well respected, and he survived. Even at some points, his German came in handy, his Russian, all different languages that he knew came in handy, and they treated him with more respect, and he was able to survive. Post the war, he never got remarried. Fortunately, never had children. A Talmud of his set him up in Montreux, Switzerland, where he lived out his life, and he was offered many positions. Svarim, which an amazing story, when he left during the war, he had tons and tons of correspondence and letters and everything, and unfortunately it was all lost. It was all destroyed by the Nazis, and he had nothing. He had one Talmud, this Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Berkowitz. He thanks him in the Akdama to his Sefer. And this Eliezer Berkowitz grabbed some of the writings of Yaakov Weinberg. He himself protected them during the years of the war. And post the war, he got these ksavim back to the Sredei. And the Sefer that the Sredei produced in his last days, living in Switzerland, was a lot of based on these writings that a Talmud of his saved. And obviously that really, he owed them tremendous debt of Lakar Satov for saving him. Now, I want to bring one last episode of the biography. And in fact, many people talk about the story. Quite an amazing story. I've seen this written up in a few spots. I got a few more details. So he was nifter in 1966. The timing of it is quite important. And he had kasher with Eretz Yisrael. He was close to many Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael. He had shaykhus to Rav Kook. And he wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Okay? So they bring the Aron to Eretz Yisrael. And the Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael, those time, a lot of them Mizrahi Rabbanim, very much were planning on burying him in the Sanhedria Beis HaKavaros. Because in those days, that's where the majority of the Mizrahi Rabbanim were buried. So that's where they wanted to bury him. We know from the Sanhedria Beis HaKavaros, today you have Rabbi Vadi Yosef is buried there, Shmuel Birnbaum, years back already, Rabbi Levine was buried there. But that's where the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael wanted him to be buried. But there was one Rosh Yeshiva, a friend of his from back in the day in Slobodka, Chaskel Sarna. At that point he was Rosh Yeshiva of the Chevron Yeshiva, the offshoot of Slobodka. It was currently in Yerushalayim. And he went to the Levi with his Talmidim. And he was there on a mission. He told his Talmidim, would not let them bury him in Sanhedria, because if they bury him in Sanhedria, he'll be defined as a Mizrahi rabbi. That's not who he was. And he said, we're going to bury him in the Chelkas Rabbanim in Har Menuchos. And being the fact he sat with the Chevron Yeshiva, many Talmidim, they got their way. But it wasn't just he was buried in Har Menuchos. Chaskel Sarna himself gave up his own spot, his own kever. He gave it over for his friend, Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, to be buried in his spot, just a few spots away from the Brisker Rav, right in the middle of the Chelkas Rabbanim in Har Menuchos. Talmidim even asked Chaskel, like, Rebbe, how could you give away your plot? He was not a youngster. He was only nifter himself just a couple of years later. But he says, Bez Hashem, there's no spots over there. He says, look, Bez Hashem, maybe I'll be buried by my father-in-law in Har Zesim. His father-in-law was Levush Mordechai, who was a Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka. And Divrei Nevius, just a short while later, was 1967, the Six-Day War, and Witaka did get back access to Har Zesim, and that's where Rav Chaskel Sarna was buried. A fitting tribute from Shemayim for his Mesiras Nefesh for his friend. But this obviously does depict that here you have a person who was sort of claimed by multiple worlds. Is he part of the yeshiva world? Is he part of the Mizrahi world? And really, post his being nifter, it was clear that he was part of the Torah Derech Eretz, the world of German history. But there are many within the YU camp that would claim him as a banner, as a forefather of Torah Umada. And what we'd like to show today is, like Rav Chaskell Sarna portrayed, you have to be very careful when you define an Adam Gadol. And you shouldn't in any way misunderstand him. So I'd like to go through 3 different aspects that I saw in reading, going through Tshuvas of the Sredei Aish. And I believe these 3 aspects will paint a picture of who he really was. So the first aspect, which I think is clear, but it's Kedai to emphasize over here, is his absolute godless in learning, his greatness in learning. The Sredei Aish paskined on such major shaylos that affected his times. One of them, before the full uprising, full Holocaust, brought about by Nazis, Yimach Shemam. But one of the first things they did, and this was actually the only clear gzera they made against Judaism, the Torah, was they outlawed the classic shkita. They passed laws in Germany that you cannot just shecht an animal. You'd first have to stun the animal. And this is a major, major issue. Classic shkita, we do not stun the animal, go through these things. And Yechiel, Yaakov Weinberg, in his Sredei Aish, it comes up here in Siman Daled, has a tshuva on it. Now, you have to explain, I should explain to you how tshuvas are written. Most tshuvas, from the average posek, they see the issues, and they're right, a page, a couple pages, a few pages. The Sredei Aish, you're talking about tshuvas which have pages upon pages. Words don't do justice. The first step of the tshuva, Perek Aleph of the tshuva, has 47 different simanim. Sometimes read through a tshuva from Moshe Feinstein, it's like overwhelming how much the man knew. Well, the Sredei Aish does the same thing with impeccable summaries, highlights, super well organized. You can see why he worked well in Germany. Right? Amazing. Breaking down all the issues, piece after piece. To go through these tshuvas well, one share wouldn't be sufficient to do one of these tshuvas. That's how in-depth and overreaching. It's unbelievable. And then on this tshuva, this is this edition that I have here of the Sredei Aish was republished by a Talmud of his. Originally, he published it under Masada of Koch years ago, and these organized them better based on topics. Just in here itself, you're talking about close to 200 pages. It's unbelievable. On one topic. And then, not only do they have all of his tshuvas, they have here all the tshuvas from all the Rabbanim that corresponded with him. Okay? Yeah, I guess there are some people that could write a lot, but okay, who's reading it? Well, I'll tell you who's reading his tshuvas. He has no less than, look, I believe it's over half a dozen, maybe close to a dozen tshuvas on this topic by Reb Chaim Ozer. Gadol Hador, Posek Hador. Chaim Ozer goes through close to a dozen tshuvas responding on this topic. The Kovna Rav, Dvar Avram, multiple. Another Rav in Slobodka. My gosh. The Rogachover. Page after page. I'm not finished yet. This is insane. I said 200 pages. I was, undercutting it. This is more than 200 pages. 200 pages on this topic of whether you can stun animals, going through all the halachas and shchita, treifas, v'chulu, v'chulu. That's just one tshuva the man wrote. 200 pages. I think if he just stopped here, this would be an amazing piece, an amazing work, a lifetime work. 200 pages on the concept of shchita and issues with the German law. But that wasn't just that. He has an interesting shayla. I was talking to someone who was telling me, he has so many important shuvas about gerus. Yeah, I put on the first one I put, Aleph, is the one about shchita. Obviously, I couldn't fit 200 pages on one little piece, so I just gave the starting point. In Beis, I have there Tshuva and Yeridea Siman Samach Zayin. That was a tshuva dealing with an interesting issue. Someone wanted to be Megayer, and we know three basic things any person wants to be Megayer is he needs Tefillah, Mila, and Kabbalas Mitzvahs. Now, the person was ready to go to the mikvah and he's ready to Kabbalah all the mitzvahs. He was sick, and health-wise, he couldn't do a bris milah. What to do in such a situation? Can you get by without doing a bris? If you physically can't do it. And he has a whole tshuva on the topic, pushing back against other rabbanim. It's a nice little piece. Afterwards, Chaim Ozer responded to this one too. In the middle piece, he writes, "Yeah, you're 100% right that Yaakov Weinberg, the Sredei Aish, ruled that you cannot be makabel such a person as a ger. You need specifically to go through a bris milah, and short of that would not work." And Chaim Ozer tells me he's 100% right. In his Akdama, I think I caught him saying a line where he talks about he feels very happy that he got correspondence from Av Rabbanim, and his lashon is most of the time they agree to what he wrote. On this, going back a second to the stunning the animal, the shchita shaila. So there at one point, he got a message from the Brisker Rav, Shem Reb Chaim Ozer, that he should not publish the tshuva, which he put it in there at tzad to be mekel. And the language he got from the messenger was that Reb Chaim Ozer held that it's wrong, his conclusion. And Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg did not take softly that response. He wrote back, he's 100% willing not to publish it, to be Mvatal Das, to the Gadol Hador, Chaim Ozer. But to say that he's wrong, he's not ready to back down. Chaim Ozer clarified that wasn't exactly what he said, but most of the times, he got it right. He has a whole kuntris, okay? Now, Stam Tshuva, he could have 200 pages. You can imagine how much a kuntris has. So he wrote an entire kuntris. I do think it's under 200 pages. But he wrote a whole kuntris on the topic of, unfortunately, a very important shaila for those days in Europe, whether you can move the bones of a kever. He talks about the situation, I believe it was after World War I already, where the Jewish community was wiped out, and there's very few people still in that little shtat. And they want to know, can they move the kvarim to a more Jewish part? This sad reality of Galus. Here, after the war, there's not much left. He writes in the Tshuva, there were 3 Jewish families still living in that city. But the family wanted to move it They say they know that their mother and their sisters would want all the tsar that's involved in moving a kever. It's a tsar for the neshamas of the deceased. But the family says they would want us to move the kvarim. This way we'll be able to come and daven there. Secondly, part of the shayla is the Jewish cemetery is not going to be able to be watched. There's not much of a community there. No, they can't put guards there, and who knows what type of vandalism. And thirdly, besides vandalism, who knows when the government's going to come and just wipe out that cemetery, which unfortunately we know was very prevalent. They'll knock out a cemetery, build a road, and then anyway, that's a bizayon to the mace. So wouldn't this be a better situation to do? He has a whole kuntris dealing with this weighty shayla. Obviously, emotionally, you hear these tainas, you want to see what you can to help, but halachically, not so simple. One interesting aspect about this taina, about this tshuva he wrote when he was in Berlin, and when he was running seminary there, the rabbinic seminary, and there was a young Talmud Chacham who wanted smicha from the German seminary there, because to get access to the German libraries, we had a lot of, this is pre-World War II, they had a lot of archives. You needed to be officially ordained as a German rabbi. So this young Talmud Chacham, he might have had a smicha before this, but wanted to obtain smicha. So he went to Sredei Aish and asked him, how do you get, I want access to these things, so I need smicha. Can you give me smicha? So, don't you think the Yechiel seminary has very clear guidelines of how to get smicha? It was not overnight. There were very, very clear guidelines. Well, this young Rav said, I don't have the time for this. Is there any way you could test me, you could this, So, Yechiel Yaakov might have been the head of the German, religious school, but he himself wasn't a Yechiel. So he's trying to figure out a way, this. So he's like, maybe I give him like a tough sefer to read, faher on that. So he gave over this kuntris on Pinas Atzamos of moving graves. He asked him to read it. Try to make yourself through this kuntris. See if you can handle it. Well, that young Rav did. He brought it back to him. The legend is the next night, read through the entire thing and gave back ha'aras on it. And with that, Menachem Mendel Schneerson got a smicha. Interesting story. It's been documented in a couple spots. But most documented, I have the tshuvas, that I have the ha'aras that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote back. It's right here in the sefer. Is impressive. That's just another story. Quickly, he has a piece in this one I didn't get to put on the sheets about the whole piece about abortions and going through a very shver marsha that talks about that why did Paro Mitzrayim, why did he have the Jewish ladies kill the babies? Why didn't he have Mitzrayim ladies do it? Right? If you want to kill Jewish babies, it wouldn't be smarter to. So the Marsha says a lumdish step, because the guy is mitzvah on not killing another, on Ben Noach is mitzvah on abortions, but a Jew isn't. And he goes through, it's stiras, it's not so simple. He has a few lumdisha answers, to defend this pretty shver Marsha. For all dealing with abortions. I want to just show one more point, which, I could go through. There are so many tshuvas. If you read through the tshuvas, if you could make it through the tshuvas, right? You can't write a historical biography if you can't read through a tshuva. But you go through these things. It's such godless that the Sredei Aish has. He also has Kiddush on Shas. I happen to have those farm too. Amazing what the godless in Torah that the Sredei Aish had, and the respect that you clearly see that all the Rabbanim of the time had for him. In fact, Who writes the Haskama for this new print of the Sredei Aish? I'll tell you. First Haskama is Rav Yosef Shalom Al Yashav Shlita. Not bad. Pretty good. Yitzchak Shiner, Shlomo Volbi, Tzar Rakov. Yeah, a lot of Chosheva people mask him to his godless. In this generation, Kol Shekain in the last generation. But just one more, you know who's the best person to give a description of an Adam Gadol? Another Adam Gadol. In one of the tshuvas I found, someone asked him, "What do you think of the Chazon Ish?" So if you look in the back of your sheets, he tells you what he thinks of the Chazon Ish. I'll click and read it. He writes, he says, Masha Shol Adas Kadluso Shalagon Chasid Bal Chazon Ish, Higayin Bari Vitzolo. His thinking is clear. Omiki Ian Va'avas Apshat, his depth of understanding and his love of figuring out the right pshat. His rachim pilpam avriach b'makom shein la'achizim b'mashmas al-lashon. He'll shy away from wild interpretations that don't fit into the language. V'ikar yashiv asaris b'shanim boda b'chadaro. The main thing is this man sat for decades locked away in his room. V'avar kol shas rishonim poskim v'iyan masmid ashakol halacha ha'isabrulo, until all halachas were clear to him. V'chasidasa agdolo here v'chalik neged rishonim, with his tremendous chasidus. He would never pick fights with the earlier generation of the rishonim. Atarach lamed b'divreim. He tried very hard to understand what they say. Avol tir chazulo yivil l'siv v'hagyon l'ikulam ha'kosov. Torah's emes ha'isab b'fiu. He learned Torah's emes. Abba divrei Torah v'his zikr rishonim niva mi'emunasa ha'chazak ha'shrach kodesh shorts of beis midrashim. And his connection to the rishonim was because he believed in them and they had divine assistance. Agrami Vilna Hirshel Atzam Alabamim Lintos Midivrei Rishonim Perish Mishnayos. You know, the Gross sometimes will challenge the Rishonim in the parish of the Mishnayos. Lokina Chazon Ish. That's not what the Chazon Ish did. V'vaneshu Gadol Hador b'Miksos Halacha v'Chasidus v'Sofalo Zor HaKadosha. There's no question he was the Gadol Hador. V'Haya Kamosu v'Bedoro v'Bedoro Sakodmin Izman Hagra v'Elach. It takes one to know one. Such a beautiful description. I'm not sure if I saw any better description than this, describing who the Chazon Ish was. But it takes one to know one. And I think that's a fitting summary to the first part, that the Sredei Aish, no question about it, possessed tremendous godless. You know, and people will dig up some letter or some this. First of all, you know, there was some controversy. Someone published private letters of his after him passing away. It's a clear thing. I mean, you can't do such a thing. And I saw the Rav that did it. He went to his kever to ask Mechila. But you know, people are playing around with the memory and the image and the kavod of an Adam Gadol who wrote a kuntris on kavod hames. It wasn't so quickly, you know, to matter moving kvarim. You know, it's only appropriate he should have kavod hames, and people should appreciate, you know, who he was. Second part I'd like to get to, and after saying what I said, I think now's the okay time to talk about it. I was going through the tshuvas, and I came across a very interesting tshuva. This is Even Ezer Siman Ayin Zayin. Listen to what the topic is. The title of the topic is Immutul Narim V'Naros L'Shir B'Yachad Shirei Kodesh. Could Jewish boys and girls sing together Jewish songs? Okay, I'm like, ooh, that's an interesting topic. He writes, Methovo miyom chasteves derech achina shar argon yeshurin shenosa be'eretz tzarfas l'fnei kama shonim. He's addressing an organization called Yeshurin, which was set up in France years ago. Shumisnaid al pi shitas achinuch she'nog b'medinas Ashkenaz u'fliach korban. And they're basing this French Jewish, I'll call it Kiruv organization, is basing their actions on what the Germans did years before. And now the Charedim are standing up against them. The way that they're doing Kiruv, the way that they're having sing together, boys and girls, is not proper. This is the Shaila which was posed to the Sredei Aish, rightfully posed to him, because he's someone who understood what went on in Germany and how come in Germany they did such things. And this question was posed to him. Okay? Well, this didn't make 200 pages, but he has a nine-piece tshuva on this. And part of the tshuva definitely is to defend where the Germans were coming from in taking such a position. Now, I read this, I'm like, this does look a little bit controversial.
What year was it?
I could see, good question. It doesn't, the tshuva is not dated. But this tshuva, of what I know of French Jewry really has this major schism where they have a tremendous element of Charedim in France, and they have what you call a more modern Kiruv style element in France. There's nothing sort of in between. It's two extremes. And, one side was fighting the other and how we should go about doing Kiruv. And they sent him the Shaila. I just, after I found this, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he's like, oh yeah, I remember I was once at a Mizrahi type event in Israel, and they had boys and girls singing. And this friend of mine told me that he was trying to figure out, okay, what should we do for marriage? It's not so simple, hearing Kol Isha by davening. You're going to be able to daven, potentially. So he said, people should go into a different group to daven, and the person involved in the event spit back, Sredei Aish, Even Ezer, Siman Ayin Zayin. The defense that the person had there was he had on his fingertips this Sredei Aish. This is famous. This quote-unquote heter. This is what my friend Reb David told me about his Shabbos he spent in Hebron, Harvey. It's David's fault. So, Lamaisa, I see in Lakewood they just published a new sefer, actually on Hilchas Yichud and different harchakas from women. And this is the way a Lakewood Posek writes it today. If you look in Os Hey, Shmuel Felder, the Posek of the Lakewood Yeshiva, writes, Yedua sheb'medinas Ashkenaz yitiru kama gedol masas misibas onik Shabbos mizmarim sham na'arim v'naras b'yachad. It's known in Europe, in Germany, that many gedolim permitted by misibas for them to sing together. You should understand this is only a heter under extenuating circumstances. Because of the haskala that challenged many. They felt that they had to give a certain chashivas for Shabbos. And they had to matter, they had to permit these co-ed Onek Shabbos, because otherwise they might be keeping Shabbos. That was the mentality back in Germany. Then he goes through exactly the heter, obviously not so simple. And you also have to know this really takes major gadlus and gedolim where you could apply such a heter. Okay, the Rabbanim did that in Germany, and perhaps we could defend such a thing at the time in Germany. Is that extended? Can you extend that to France? Can you extend that nowadays to the Mizrahi segment in Eretz Yisrael? that be extended in America to NCSY? These are all major shilos for Gedolim, and definitely not so simple. But the Sredei Aish, was somebody that was not afraid, and he was a Gadol, to tackle these things. Obviously, from my Rebbe, that this is definitely not something that we would ever encourage and ever really be involved with. But Lamaisa, there are those that utilize such a heter, and you have to know, is the heter from the Sredei Aish, Ibn Ezer, Siman Ayin Zayin, is that applicable in this case or not? So I think once the Sredei Aish has such a heter in the books, all they need is that one heter to start painting him. Oh, look, the modern Orthodox rabbi, the Sredei Aish, the father of. You have to be very, very careful before you paint such a picture. Very not simple. It's not true. One last area I'd like to touch on, and this I think is very unique. If you read the Hakdama to the Sefer, the Shel Shuv Sredei Aish, Rabbeinu always told me it's very good to read Hakdamas, but I think it's a super inspiring introduction to the Sefer. Really, I would say it's required readings. Rav Chaim Ozer wrote an amazing introduction to his Achiezer, writing something during World War going on. The Sredei Aish, literally, what's the name of the Sefer Sredei Aish? If you look in the back of your sheets, the second to this is not the entire Hakdama, I skipped in the middle. But if you look on the first part, second to last paragraph, he writes, Karasi Shmo Sredei Aish. I named the Sefer Sredei Aish. Literally, the remnants of the fire. Ki Kishmo Kenu. Sridzir Me'al Srefer Shasharf Hashem. This is just a little bit from the fire that unfortunately HaKadosh Baruch Hu burnt in the Jewish people. And he writes at the end of that including that Srefer with most of his Torah, of all his Ksavim that he had, they were destroyed. And it's only a little bit. Now, if you actually look what they published today from the Sredei Aish, it's quite a bit. It's quite a lot. But he's saying that was just a tipa min hayam. You can imagine how many 200-page kuntresim he had that were lost. But he has a fascinating take on why to publish a Shalosh Tshuva Sefer. I'm not sure I ever saw anyone explain it like this. He first writes about, all the different tshuvas he had. In the second paragraph, in the second part of the sheet, he writes, I didn't hold back from publishing my tshuvas mishum chashivosam historias, because of the very important historical significance. Because by reading my tshuvas, by seeing the issues the Rabbanim were dealing with back in the day in Europe, you see the challenges. You see what was going on with challenges of the Haskalah, challenges with German laws, challenges after the World War, what's going to be with the Jewish cemetery. It's important to publish tshuvas for the historical perspective of what it is. Furthermore, he writes, the Chelko Sheni Pinasti, the next paragraph, Tshuva Shekasati L'Sholom Ba'ashkenaz L'Shar Artzos. I made tshuvas that I was asked when I was in Germany, times when I was sitting back in peace and quiet, but others in more upheaval. The next paragraph he writes, "Besifri Kanisi Achim Tavin She'emim Lo Ikre Akiras Harim Afilu Chedushim Gedolim." And you'll find some things here. It's not a brilliant insight of Okar Harim, and it's not major Chedushim. Avol Yesh Bem Mishum Zecher Hayamim. But my tshuvas, they tell the history. Remember those days Yemei Shalvu Pirachav, Yemei Mitsuka V'dachin, days of peace and quiet, but also days of upheaval and depression. And Shebehem Zochisu L'Sheves Al Kisei Hara Shel Gedolei Yisrael. I was zocha to be one, sit on the chair of Hara together with many Gedolei Yisrael. Then he writes about the beautiful Beis Medrash that he had, the yeshiva that he had in Germany. I'll read you the last paragraph. It's so beautiful. Beis Medrasheno Agadol Chareb Avasena Harabim. The rabbinic school in Germany does not exist. But its remembrance is not lost in the hearts of its Talmidim. Many of the students who survived the war, they became the Rabbanim in Washington Heights and throughout the Jewish world. Many went up to Eretz Yisrael, also were involved in Chinuch Hadati, and some people went into government. The Kulam also Mechizuk Torah Yisrael, the Eretz Yisrael. So many of them were Mechazik Torah Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. Yehi Shmo Agadol Baruch Muvarach. Yavona Sifri Zeh Kimat Sevat Snua. Let this sefer stand as a delicate monument, a quiet monument. The base of Mikdash Ma'at, Shememeshach Shmonim Shana, if it's Torah v'Oral, Poser Yisrael. But my sefer of the Tshuvas that came out of that school from that period served as a matzeva for the world that we lost. I think in reading his Tshuvas, we get a better picture of who the man was. His Svarim are a matzeva for who he really was. He was somebody that belonged right in the middle of Chalkas HaRabbanim, just like his physical matzeva, thanks to the efforts of Chaskel Sarna, is standing right there in the Chalkas HaRabbanim, not far from the Brisker Rav and other great Rabbanim, right there in Har Menuchos. But his spiritual matzeva, his Svarim, his Gadlus and Torah, also stands as a matzeva that no one should misconstrue and misunderstand how great the Sredei Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg was. Just to finish off and go through the quick recap of what we did this year. Kanai Nahar, it was over 30 shiurim. Just flip through different categories. So as mentioned, this was the third in the series of shiurim directly on Gedolim, together with Rav Moshe and Chaim Ozer. We did also sub-series of shiurim on different hanhados of Gedolim. We did a shir right after the passing of Chaim Kanievsky on the Seder, what a Seder was like by Rav Chaim Kanievsky's house. We gave a shir on the halachas of Mesiras Nefesh, dedicated to the 10th yahrzeit of Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, who lived with Mesiras Nefesh. We always have shiurim on Baruch Hashem on the Moadim. We went through the sound of a shofar, halachas of Erev Yom Kippur, Sukkos in Florida, going away for Hanukkah, Parsha Zachar for women, Kedima in divvying out Matanos Levionim, Pesach cookies and Chametz cooking spray, the Shir for Daled Kosos, especially this year when it was a Friday night, the best time for counting Sefiras HaOmer, Milchiks on Shavuos. We went through many topics which, quote unquote, were in the news. The halachic legitimacy of boycotts, let's say boycotting Ben and Jerry's, lost in the Surfside rubble, therapists and the Isser of Yichud. We gave a share on the kashrus of uncertified products called Grey Goose on the Loose. Gave a share on the Daylight Saving Times bill and how it will affect Jewish communities throughout America. We did last week a whole share on hard money loans. Gave a share about the construction of mikvahs, Erev on the other side of the canal, automatic watches, and many, many other topics were touched upon this year. So we compiled a list based on the votes of many people. I'm sorry if not everyone's votes made it to the top 10 list, but I'll quickly run through with maybe a little bit of postscript in some of them. The dairy dilemma of what to do eating on Shavuos runs in number 10, and I heard a lot of people were hawking about what to do in their meals on Shavuos after this, and I got lots and lots of people ask my wife for recipes, how to make a charcuterie board for dessert, so you can have milchiks and fleishiks. A lot of people were, the whole idea about two breads, the Ramah. Number 9, lost in the surfside rubble, the halachas of Hashavas Aveda, actually for things lost in the building. I didn't get a chance to touch on it in the share, but on the back page, there's a tshuva that the Sredei Aish deals with about svarim that were found after the war. And people in both circumstances, we talked about in Surfside, there's a tzad to be makel for sure, because that would be the Zutel Shal Yom, it's like lost at sea. And we talked about then with Nimashur Sadin, do you still return it or not? But Surfside rubble might fall into classic El Metzias. But the Sredei Aish fought back about svarim saved from Europe, that not so simple to permit them. And especially somebody himself who lost his own ksavim, understood well what it means to lose svarim, during the war. We gave a share on therapists and the Isser of Yichud. We did this unfortunately after a big scandal, tragedy that affected the Jewish people. It was interesting, we came out very strongly against a male therapist being involved with women. A little while after that, when the major poskim in Eretz Yisrael, and for sure in the American scene, Gitzel Berkowitz, I believe, came out with a Kolkori, a tshuva, that same thing, answering mixed gender therapy relationships that absolutely should be avoided. Unfortunately, there's been way too many problems with it. Daylight saving times bill. I saw we got quite a few, besides all the people talking about it in the share. I remember checking out that had a lot of views online. So I don't think you listened to it multiple times. So it's probably many people saw that one as relevant, not just to Florida, but all over. Grey goose on the loose, the kashrus of uncertified products comes up a lot, and it's very important for people to understand the kashrus scene. I remember a lot of people in the kashrus world were very up in arms how people could sometimes neglect the importance of buying something with a kashrus symbol on it. Number 5, the size of a Kiddush cup on Pesach. It's a pretty relative, basic share, but it was very important. A lot of people remembered asking me before Pesach about the size of their cups and how to deal with things, and they're definitely very relevant. Unfortunately, a lot of times people just, by lack of knowledge, just go with the flow, and whatever size cup they have, they use, and they end up getting sick and not being able to drink the whole cup. And a lot of times, if you just know the size that you need, it will make things much, much easier. You can use that for other years too. Number 4, we have to put on Ramosha. I was afraid to do this year for many years, but we finally got the courage and gave a share on Ramosha. Tremendous personality that affects the lives of everyone living in America. Ada Yom Hazeh. Another topic, some might call controversial, but we debated whether one should have an AC sukkahs in Florida. And the old generation, the new generation, I remember it got hot in here. Right. But nice. We went through the halachas involving that. And the final two, number 2 was voted the Seder by Reb Chaim Kanievsky. The whole world is grasping onto anything they could get in the life of this amazing person that we were so to have in our generation. And some of the most watched years ago, I gave some share about Reb Chaim Kanievsky's buha, the language he used. Hundreds and hundreds of people watched that share. We did give a share on Chaim Kanievsky and the mitzvah peruvu, fertility treatments, different properties, chusim, to have children. Chaim had many different segulas, and it's supposed to have children. Gave a whole share in that many people. But also, Chaim Kanievsky's Seder was a big hit, and many have stopped by that. But the number one share, according to the rankings from the Home Office, is hard money loans.
Again.
Just last week, those know the share did have standing room only, and after the share, my wife was getting phone calls. After the share, people were trying to track me down, and luckily not with a bullet on my back, a bullseye on my back. But
everybody wants to talk about Dan Gilbert. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's regular interest. But yeah, hard money loans. A few people explain themselves. Oh, it's not exactly what I do. Yeah, we do.
Dan Gilbert also wants a company.
Other things which are also not so simple. Credit card. What's it called? Alan, help me out.
Factoring?
Huh?
Factoring?
Yeah, basically factoring. Dibs on percentage of all the credit card returns to pay off expenses the business has, and all that. That's a different problem of okay. It's not the classic, not the ribbis issue necessarily per se. But that is a summary of all the topics. I'm sure the Sredei would have broken the top 10, but I can't vote in it. But I'd like to wish everybody a safe and wonderful, enjoyable summer. And Be'ez Hashem, we look to be back here, some form or another. Who knows what's going to be with the building? But halacha must go on, Torah must go on, Be'ez Hashem. And tune in to emails. Thank you again, everyone, for participating.
I can't believe I missed last year. That's my business.